Thanks for watching. All audiovisual content is original and are creations by Emmanuel Isaiah Smith.
Hello, good morning. It is your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, and today's date is Saturday, January 10th, 2025. The time is 9:43 a.m. and I am in Kendall, Florida. The topic of today's lecture is the Schutzstaffel and Gangstalking, similarities in operation. And I'd like to let you know in advance, ladies and gentlemen, that I tend to do these lectures outdoors, and I may have to raise or project my voice from time to time in order to drown out any background noise that may occur. Please adjust your volume accordingly. And I felt it necessary to do a video, a full-length video on the Schutzstaffel and its similarities to gangstalking. During my research and my experiential activity concerning clandestine gang stalking, which I consider to be the political problem of the 21st century, I've come across many different programs that have existed throughout history that remind me very much of the kinds of activity that's present in clandestine gang stalking. There's COINTELPRO, there's MK Ultra, there's the Schutzstaffel, which was a Nazi German paramilitary conglomerate. There's the NKVD, which is a Soviet system of espionage and disruption. And then there's gang stalking, which is obviously derived from various components of each of these programs. And what all of these derivative programs that have existed in various countries throughout history have in common is they all use disruption, they all use espionage, they all use trickery and deception, they all use unjust incarceration mechanisms, they all use murder mechanisms. They use plainclothes, state officers. They use civilian informants. And they use other secret or covert mechanisms to essentially apprehend citizens for a variety of reasons, and they're all state sanctioned, meaning that the government of these respective countries use state resources to execute these programs, and that includes gang stalking. Gang stalking is also a state sanctioned disruption, espionage, trickery and deception, attack and murder mechanism. And it's necessary for anyone researching gang stalking, its merits and its consequences, to know that it is essentially the spiritual progeny of MK Ultra, COINTELPRO, the Schutzstaffel, and the NKVD, also known as the Soviet People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs. Furthermore, it should be noted that all of these programs in various countries are responsible for crimes against humanity, including human experimentation and various other deleterious uses of state resources to punish alleged enemies of the state, subversives, and political dissidents. I would also like to note, ladies and gentlemen, that every country in the entire world has had sequences in their history that they're not particularly proud of, but that they can learn from. In Germany, you had the Third Reich, which committed some of the most blatant and notable crimes against humanity, including mass murder and attempted extermination of people. Russia had its NKVD and its Gulag protocol, in which persons that were deemed deleterious to Russian society were essentially arrested or kidnapped and thrown in Gulag camps under horrible work conditions for indefinite periods of time, resulting in illnesses, some of which resulted in the demise of the prisoner, and also organized execution of prisoners in various capacities. There are many instances of crimes against humanity that have befallen citizens of countries around the world. However, it's important to learn from these episodes in history and become better governments, having learned from them, better private auxiliaries, and better citizens, having learned from these episodes in history. In the United States, the transatlantic slave trade was most definitely a crime against humanity, and as were many of the Reconstruction era domestic terroristic crimes that were committed against freemen and their supporters in the American South in particular by various terroristic organizations that rounded up these freemen and their supporters by the dozens, by the hundreds, by the thousands, and committed horrible crimes against them in the name of segregation and so forth. These are things that America has learned from, but apparently not enough, because now we have clandestine gang stalking, ladies and gentlemen. And in my estimation, this program is every bit as bad as the crimes that were committed against freemen and their supporters during the Reconstruction era. Lynchings and so forth. Mass murders of freemen and their supporters. burning down of their homes and so forth, the disruption of their livelihoods. All of these are components of clandestine gang stalking. I would also like to note, ladies and gentlemen, that Germany has come a long way since the Third Reich. Sometimes it's difficult to believe that Adolf Hitler and his Schutzstaffel were live and in full effect a mere 85 years ago. Germany has since condemned the actions of its Third Reich and has ensured that political treatises and statutes have been implemented since then to ensure that such a thing never happened again in its borders. And that's commendable on the part of Germany. Ladies and gentlemen, Adolf Hitler had a fantasy. His fantasy was an eternal Reich centered in Germany that would go on to conquer all of Europe and eventually the world under a banner of eugenics, xenophobia, the semi-religious philosophy that he held concerning the innate superiority of Nordic or Aryan people. Hitler wanted to impose this fantasy on the entire world and indeed conquer that world similarly to how the Romans did in early medieval times, beginning with Emperor Caesar Augustus. Adolf Hitler's Reich combined elements of Greco-Roman mystery religions, protocols and procedures from the order of the Jesuits, which is ironic considering that the Nazis were very anti-Christian. It included elements of the occult and witchcraft, all of which were centered around the state-sanctioned murder mechanism brought about through covert tactics such as espionage and the use of hundreds of thousands of informants throughout Germany to report to local police and semi-military agencies the drawbacks and consequences of not exhibiting and demonstrating full loyalty to the Third Reich and its aims. Adolf Hitler's earliest influences in his Eternal Reich fantasy was from the works of an Austrian monk named George Lanz von Liebenfels, who was the first to use the swastika image, particularly in his magazine, the Ostara, which was a folk Germanic book of mysticism that asserted that the Nordic tribes of this earth were descended from a divine electron that was set forth by the Nordic god Odin, which was used to create the Nordic people, while lesser mechanisms were used to create non-Nordic people. Yes, even those Europeans from the western, central, southern, and Mediterranean parts of Europe. These Europeans in Liebenfeld's mind being inferior to the Nordic or Aryan peoples. And Liebenfeld sought to start a mystery religion based on these beliefs of the divinity of Aryan people, of Nordic people, of those tribes that he believed were crafted and formed by a divine electron that originated in the sky. Liebenfeld wrote a book called Theozoology, in which he expounded upon these supposed revelations of a spiritual nature that he had concerning the superiority of the Aryan or Nordic people. The legend goes that Lanz von Liebenfels, while a monk in Austria, stumbled across the gravestone of a Knight Templar, the French soldiers and cavalrymen that invaded the Holy Land in the year 1099 and claimed Jerusalem for the French crown. Having stumbled upon this gravestone, he developed a personal vision of a conquering Aryan people, a Germanic people, a Nordic people that were descended from Odin himself through the divine electron. He produced a magazine called the Ostara, in which he furthered these theological assumptions, these theological visions, these theological revelations. And he used the swastika as his banner. Adolf Hitler would have been around 19 years of age, having been born in Austria himself, and was no doubt influenced by von Liebenfeld's theological assertions concerning the superiority of the Aryan people. Von Liebenfeld actually claimed at some point to have met a young Hitler as a teenager, because Hitler was interested in the Ostara magazine that von Liebenfeld published. Von Liebenfeld was eventually defrocked as a monk for problems controlling himself around animals, from what I have gathered in various documents and research that I've done over the years. However, his Ostara magazine, in spite of that, remained popular in the geographic territory corresponding to Austria-Hungary. So, it's kind of ironic that this man that put forth these folkish theological theories of the superiority of the Aryan people, by virtue of this divine electron that he believes is the creating force of the Aryans, this man outlived Hitler by about 10 years. It's ironic because he was the remote mentor of Hitler through his Germanic doctrines of superiority, and was no doubt ground zero for Adolf Hitler's racial beliefs, which bordered on theological beliefs. Ladies and gentlemen, Nazism at its core is a pseudo-religious construct. No doubt the Ostara magazine by Volk Liebenfels, which was named after the Germanic goddess of spring, dawn, and fertility, embedded in a young Adolf Hitler the idea of the divinity of living persons. It should be noted, ladies and gentlemen, that the Schutzstaffel, which had 5 leaders over its history, which was from 1925 to 1945. And these leaders were Julius Schreck, Joseph Berchtold, Erhard Hayden, Heinrich Himmler, and Karl Hank. This Schutzstaffel started off small. It simply started off as a way of protecting a young and then fledgling political figure, Adolf Hitler, during his days as a dreamer of an international Reich spearheaded by these Nordic people that he believed were of a divine nature. This Schutzstaffel, which began in 1925, long before Hitler became the Führer, or the Reich Chancellor of Germany, began as a new form of a religious sect with its own rites and customs. The Schutzstaffel, and indeed the Third Reich, was more than a government, ladies and gentlemen. It was a religious organization. It was a church with Adolf Hitler as its prophet. And Pan-Germanism as its religious doctrine. with the God being nothing more than a spiritual conglomeration of ideas concerning expansion, particularly that of the Aryan folk. Ladies and gentlemen, the Schutzstaffel was a conglomerate of military and police services. It started off with a few thousand and ended up with over 1 million active employees in this conglomerate. The Schutzstaffel had a number of subunits, one of which was the Sicherheitsdienst, or the SD, and the Gestapo, which is the organization that employed thousands of plainclothes Germans to serve as double agents, really. Okay? These deputized plainclothes Germans worked in factories. They worked as steel workers, they worked as janitors, they worked as barbers. Some worked in schools and universities. Some worked in hospitals, some worked in churches. These double agents worked in many different types of employment situations where they'd be around lots of people. And they would keep an ear to what people were saying so as to listen for subversive rhetoric from any German citizen. If any rhetoric that was subversive or dissident to the Nazi regime was heard, these Gestapo deputies would report it to Gestapo officers who would report it to their superiors. And at that point, the dissidents who had been informed on by the plainclothes Gestapo deputies would be rounded up, incarcerated, put in work camps, or even executed. The Gestapo, ladies and gentlemen, has striking similarities to clandestine gang stalking. The Gestapo did more than just keep an ear to German societies to see who was potentially dissident. They also used discrediting campaigns to discredit people that they suspected might be dissidents. This is something that's used in clandestine gang stalking quite often. Targeted individuals are regularly discredited, maligned, vilified. And made into pariahs in a systemic fashion, just as targeted individuals are. Libel, slander, and defamation of character are needed by liaisons, undercovers, and stalkers to continually create a sense of paranoia among gang stalkers concerning a targeted individual, and why that person needs to be not only watched, but disrupted, harassed, attacked, pestered, harmed, driven out. These very mechanisms were used by the Gestapo as early as 1938. There were many different elements of this Gestapo that are reminiscent, particularly of gang stalking. The Gestapo being one of the subunits of the Schutzstaffel, it was overseen by Heinrich Himmler, who had, by 1943, 100,000 informers in the Gestapo. This is highly similar to how gang stalking operates. The targeted individual is constantly surrounded by informers, undercover operatives, stalkers who have been semi-deputized, and then those stalkers that do nothing but take signals from other stalkers as to the person's whereabouts so as to point that person out using a clandestine system of signals and cues to other stalkers, undercover operatives, and liaisons, so that the targeted person's whereabouts are always known to stalkers. Another interesting conundrum that Germany faced concerning the Gestapo was that there were subunits of the Gestapo that had people assisting in plain clothes that had no law enforcement experience at all, no military training at all. They were just simply persons that were told to watch this area or that area, this institution, that institution, this neighborhood, that neighborhood, this workplace or that workplace, looking for political dissidents. Okay, there was no freedom of speech in Nazi Germany. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll have you know that freedom of speech is under attack right here in the United States. Clandestine gang stalking, which is a mirror replica of the Gestapo, in so much as I like to refer to it as the neo-Gestapo, seeks to hinder freedom of speech by retaliating constantly against targeted persons like myself that have decided to come forward about this thuggery called clandestine gang stalking. Adolf Hitler, ladies and gentlemen, was a man of devices. He liked to use his Gestapo to stage events so as to vilify his enemies. The Gestapo was constantly staging catastrophes and blaming the catastrophes on the enemies of Hitler so as to create a false narrative as to Hitler's enemies' activity, so as to create a pretext for attacking that enemy. Not much unlike clandestine gang stalking, ladies and gentlemen. Gang stalkers across the racial spectrum are constantly instigating altercations, disruptions, fracas with targeted persons having been signaled to their exact location by other targets. by other stalkers. Why? With the expectation that the targeted person will lash out in anger, which will further give liaisons, undercovers, and stalkers a pretext to continue stalking, surveilling, and disrupting that target. He's violent. He's unhinged. He's unruly. He's hot-headed. He's ill-tempered. Look at how he just lashed out at that stalker. We must continue our gang stalking campaign against him at all costs. These are the very mechanisms that were used in the Third Reich against the enemies of Hitler. Instigated conflicts and skirmishes were caused on the German border with the Poles. All right, with the French. Even with the Russians. Instigated conflicts as a pretext to invade and conquer. Gang stalking uses instigated conflicts from stalker to target as a pretext to move in and disrupt. There could be nothing going on. A stalker is signaled to a targeted person's location. Maybe it's a group of stalkers that are signaled to a targeted person's exact location, and they descend upon him with so much pestering and harassment, sometimes bacterial contamination through the air, using various bodily functions. All a target can do is evade or confront. If he confronts, his actions are obviously being monitored by stalkers from afar and would be mischaracterized as acts of violence and hostility, and thus a pretext to continue stalking him in the interest of his own safety and the safety of others, as they'll say. Workplace mobbing, ladies and gentlemen. The Schutzstaffel, at some point in the late 30s, began prosecuting Jewish persons en masse so as to remove them from their various positions of authority, power, and influence. And mind you, ladies and gentlemen, the Jewish people, particularly the Ashkenazi Jewish people, have faced persecution in many countries across Europe. I've always found it kind of ironic because in the Middle Ages, even going back to the empires of Rome, Jews had a penchant for devising financial products that were utilized by the kings of Europe to do public works, to issue currency, and to build an economy based on the borrowing mechanism, the interest-bearing mechanism, and the establishment of credit. These mechanisms were embraced by some, not by others. But no doubt these mechanisms were historical in nature due to their capacity to establish vast governments, vast militaries, vast educational systems, large banks, vast neighborhoods. housing, industry and commerce. I mean, after all, the Colosseum in Rome was built by the Caesars of Rome using financial products derived from Jewish sources in Italy. In my estimation, by the 1930s, you'd think that it would be an accepted part of European living. But it wasn't just banking that the Jews excelled in, it was also law, and it was also medicine. Jewish communities in Europe tended to go into these industries as a traditional mechanism, as a cultural mechanism, and as a wealth-generating mechanism. Adolf Hitler believed that these persons of Jewish descent were using their influence and authority in these various industries to subvert the populations of Europe and use their closeness to the kings of Europe and the heads of state of Europe to cement themselves as the masters of populations. Adolf Hitler resented this, not only as a politician would resent what he believed to be a subversive ethnic element in his country, but Hitler resented Jews on racial grounds as well.
Music is just amazing talent. I mean,
Most Jewish people are not Aryan, but rather are an exotic mixture of Middle Eastern, Central European, and Western European ethnic lineage. Adolf Hitler didn't like the idea of non-Aryans controlling the financial sector of Europe, or its legal sector, or its medical sector. He believed that these matters were to be pursued by Aryans and Aryans alone. Ultimately, in my estimation, if you have a community like the Jews, and you see that they're masters of industries that they dominate, if you as a head of state have an issue with these persons, in my estimation, the best way to remedy this conundrum, as you see it, is to sit down with Jewish leaders and come to a compromise as to what you believe the resolution is to your quarry. There was a World Jewish Congress at the time. There were various Jewish groups in Europe, Germany at the time. All Adolf Hitler had to do, if he had an issue with how the Jewish masters of certain industries were going about their business, he could have easily organized a committee and sat down with Jewish leaders across Europe. He could have called a council that had the same magnitude and importance as the Treaty of Versailles itself, which was a central component of Hitler's hatred for the Jews. You see, the Treaty of Versailles excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, the Treaty of Versailles, which was convened by a multinational, governmental, use panel, which for all intents and purposes is the precursor to the present day United Nations. It had a similar function. Okay, this panel forced Germany to take responsibility for the events of World War I, which led to a demoralized Germany. There were Jewish persons on those panels that forced, or rather decided through legal mechanisms, that Germany was responsible for World War I. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, we are talking about the World War II era, but the World War II era is not where Hitler's resentment of Jews came from. It came from the World War I era, when Hitler was still a teenager. So we're going back in time a little bit, exploring Hitler's problem with the Jewish persons. Hitler became aware that there were some Jewish persons on that panel that hoisted much of the blame of World War I on Germany, and Hitler, as a person who was a German citizen, resented that. And that tied into his hatred for the Jews. But back to my point, ladies and gentlemen, all Hitler had to do was call a council or a tribunal of Jewish leaders across Europe and sit down with them in the spirit of diplomacy and sanity and the common good, and put his issues on the table. He could have said, I resent the Treaty of Versailles. He could have said, I resent Jewish control of Germany's finances or its legal sector or its medical sector. He could have said that. Obviously, these views are rooted in xenophobia. But he could have said, I want more Germans in banking, or I want more ethnic Germans in banking, or I want more ethnic Germans in the law, or I want more ethnic Germans in medicine. I want more ethnic Germans in politics. And here's why. And he could have made his point or his case in a legal forum with Jewish leaders and come to some compromise based on fairness and the progress of the Germanic people. Then you don't need a Gestapo. Then you don't need a crystal knot. Then you don't need Auschwitz or the Holocaust, because now you've come to diplomatic agreements concerning things. He believed that Jewish persons were using sabotage and subversion to control Germany and Europe. And whether or not that was happening is a matter of how you, as a reader, interpret the history that you read. As far as I could tell, Jewish persons had been masters of various industries going back to medieval times. And if a problem arose concerning their handling of the economy, of finance, of the legal sector, surely these things could have been handled diplomatically. Hitler was a smart man and he had smart men working for him. Those matters could have been handled diplomatically if there were any issues. But he decided to handle them in such a way so as to spill as much blood on as much soil as he possibly could in a shock and awe terror mechanism that was meant to bring the Jewish population of Europe to its very knees, so as to punish them racially for their perceived transgressions against the European people through various industries that they were in those days the masters of. Workplace mobbing, ladies and gentlemen, the Nazi Party, under the direction of Hitler himself, wanted to disrupt Jewish progress in the workplace. Kristallnacht was a prime example of that. Thousands upon thousands of Jewish businesses ransacked, vandalized, and destroyed by the Gestapo. This effectively disrupted thousands of Jewish business owners and their families from being able to earn livings for themselves. Just like what happens in gang stalking, ladies and gentlemen. And targeted individuals' occupational career is disrupted. Their livelihoods are disrupted through the workplace mobbing mechanism, which is strategically done by liaisons, undercovers, and stalkers as a way to monitor the behavior of the target as his career, his finances, his interpersonal relationships, and indeed his very life are taken from him in such a deleterious and disruptive fashion. Yes, co-workers can be turned into weapons using the workplace mobbing mechanism. And just like Kristallnacht, which it translates from German to English as Crystal Night, the night of crystals or the night of broken glass, in which thousands of Jewish businesses were ransacked and vandalized, the windows broken out, and they were burned down in retaliation for a Jewish political dissident having killed a Nazi official in protest. Workplace mobbing is a targeted individual's own Kristallnacht, in which his livelihood is damaged and destroyed in a similar manner by a gang of Gestapo-like thugs who know how to communicate the destruction they wish to cause you in such a way that you're never meant to decode. The security arm of the Gestapo was headed up by an officer by the name of SS Heydrich. It was called the Sicherheitsdienst. They were a crew of state-sanctioned thugs that sought to expel undesirables who were racially unfit to live in Hitler's Germany. There were many different mechanisms used to disenfranchise and harm persons that Adolf Hitler saw as racially unfit or political dissidents. I oftentimes speak of intentional disease spreading and intentional sickness spreading in gang stalking campaigns. Those gang stalking campaigns like mine that are run by a crew of neo-SS troublemaking thug units called gang stalkers that are state sanctioned. You see, the concentration camps were notorious for intentional disease spreading and human experimentation, not much unlike what a targeted person experiences in a clandestine gang stalking campaign. Concentration camps centered in cities like Dachau, Mauthausen, Auschwitz, and other points in Germany were maintained in such a horrible way so as to ensure that the detainees in these concentration camps would get sick. That would make Hitler's Third Reich, particularly that under Adolf Eichmann, who was a notorious butcher in these concentration camps, guilty of bioterrorism as well as domestic terrorism, because sicknesses were used as a weapon against the detainees of the concentration camps, which included Jews, Gypsy Roma, and other persons that Hitler saw as racially unclean in accordance with his pseudo-theological beliefs concerning racial purity, particularly that of Nordic people and the Germanic people. Certainly the biological terrorism that targeted individuals face at the hands of their gang stalkers is reminiscent of the biological terrorism that many detainees in these concentration camps suffered at the hands of the Gestapo and the other radical, bloodthirsty, and blindly loyal police or military thug units that were beholden to Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Schutzstaffel and all of its subunits. With all the undercover operatives that Nazi Germany had, and there were over 100,000 of them, coupled with the paramilitary units that were under the direction of Himmler and his Schutzstaffel, rounding up political dissidents and various races of people that were seen by Adolf Hitler to be unclean was an easy task. So easy, in fact, that it was almost impossible to hide from the Nazis. Every neighborhood was patrolled by clandestine or undercover Gestapo men, just like every neighborhood in the United States is patrolled by liaisons, undercover operatives, and gang stalkers. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living in the Fourth Reich here in the United States, and the national security apparatus here in this country is the new Schutzstaffel. Targeted individuals like myself have been declared unclean and unfit to abide in American society, unfit to pursue an academic credential, unfit to pursue an occupation, unfit to accumulate wealth, unfit to pass down this wealth to my progeny, unfit to raise a family, unfit to have constitutional rights and freedoms, unfit to have inalienable rights, those rights afforded to me by God or nature, ladies and gentlemen. Just as the Nazi Party suspended all police activity aside from that which was afforded to its citizenry by the Schutzstaffel itself, in effect, a permanent martial law was imposed upon the German people and the people of neighboring European countries that Hitler had conquered. This martial law restricted all rights except those rights expressly granted to them by the Third Reich itself through policies, edicts, statutes, and ordinances. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you that clandestine gang stalking is a shadow Reich. It is a cult. It is a church. It is a religion. Its adherents are disciples of chaos, tyranny, and bloodshed. And its banner is the furtherance of some at the expense of many. It's not much unlike the Eternal Reich that Hitler talked about. This program is supposed to run forever under the banner of clandestine operations in disruption, sabotage, espionage, violence, disease spreading, and the limitation of one's ability to pursue life, liberty, and happiness from the cradle onward. The Schutzstaffel was constantly creating new police auxiliaries, new military auxiliaries, new undercover operative auxiliaries, so as to further cement its power over Europe. Not a power that represents peace through strength, but a power that represents grabbing your population by the very hair of their heads and forcing them down a path that has been preordained for them. Just like a targeted individual, military components are used, law enforcement components are used, private security components are used, plainclothes operatives are used, civilians are used.
I reckon is like pretty cool, because like you can get into the pictures and then take it a bit further, like the last movement.
In a neo-Schutzstaffel capacity,
And
under a banner of disenfranchisement and the embezzlement of human rights. Fear, shock, awe, hopelessness, tyranny, bloodshed. All of these things were derived deliberately in such a way so as to manipulate and indeed pervert the legal code of various countries in Europe so as to ensure that the secret police, namely the Gestapo, who operated using acts of espionage, subversion, trickery, and terror, to control the people. And mind you, the Gestapo in particular, which in German was referred to as the Geheimstaatspolizei, the secret state police, had the authority to arrest people without judicial oversight. It employed surveillance, intimidation, domestic terrorism, torture, kidnapping, illegal search and seizures to maintain its control over the people. That's what gang stalking is. It is illegal search and seizure of a person's very life, of their data, of their mail, of their interpersonal relationships, of their livelihood. And it's extrajudicial. It operates outside of the courts of law, just as the Gestapo operated outside of the courts of law, ladies and gentlemen. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister for enlightenment and propaganda, established a monopoly over the free press. Just as the national security and intelligence apparatus in this country has established a monopoly over the free press. In America, you cannot publish a news story unless it's approved by the national security apparatus in this country. That's why gang stalking has not been examined by the mainstream media in this country. It has not been approved by the national security apparatus, nor has it been approved by the intelligence apparatus of this country, which oversees the social engineering product known as clandestine gang stalking, organized stalking, community harassment, and covert war. My significant other Lori and I combat this evil on a daily basis, albeit administratively, with more evasions than confrontations, which truly wear on you like a heavy burden over time. Adolf Hitler commissioned Himmler to run his Schutzstaffel and take over every police organization and every military organization in the country, so as to exact the will of Hitler himself among the people. Hitler found his financing through banks, German industrialists, and taxpayer resources in such a way so as to artificially empower the people of Germany, who in many respects swore allegiance to Adolf Hitler out of fear, out of awe, and out of a divine veneration for this man, who many saw as an avatar of a deity. Disloyalty and disobedience were met with incarceration and/or execution, and there was no other way. All of the courts were wired to do the bidding of the Third Reich. And the Third Reich was the judge, jury, and executioner in every courtroom in Germany and in occupied territories, with the judges, attorneys, and other court staff as mere puppets being manipulated by the will of the Reich. I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, in my own legal battles over the past 10 years, I've managed to emerge from them unscathed because I was fortunate to have judges, attorneys, and court staff assigned to my case that upheld the letter of the law in a way that was both firm, fair, and judicial. However, other targeted persons may not be so lucky, because gang stalking is practiced in courtrooms, as is the subversion mechanisms that they bring. The varied devices that evolved from this Reich of terror, this Reich of control, this Reich of subversion, were all based on blind loyalty. The Schutzstaffel's motto is "Loyalty is my honor." And like gang stalkers, undercover operatives associated with gang stalkers and their liaisons, evidence is not a consideration, only narratives, only loyalty. And blind loyalty. Stalkers don't ask a lot of questions. Stalkers do not ask for evidence. They simply take signals and they move in and disrupt. The branches of the Schutzstaffel were the Allgemeine SS, or the General SS, which was an administrative unit that had at its peak 100,000 employees. They all held office positions that were indicative of administratives to the will of the Führer of Nazi Germany. You had the Waffen SS, or the Armed SS, which was the military or combat branch that had 900,000 members at its peak in 1944. And then you had the SS Totenkopfverband, also known as the Death Head units. And these units were responsible for administrating and guarding the concentration and extermination camps. Now, I'll have you know that the Schutzstaffel was organized into three main units: the Allgemein, the Waffen, and the Totenkopfverband. Just like gang stalking is organized into three main units: liaisons, undercover operatives, and the stalkers themselves. Liaisons, like the Allgemein, are administrators. They get the action started with signals, verbal commands, and electronic communications. The Waffen SS are like undercover operatives because many of them have military or police training. And the Totenkopfverband are like gang stalkers in that they are responsible for the hands-on approach and the domestic terroristic elements and disruptive elements of gang stalking. Allgemein, Waffen, Totenkopfverband, liaisons, undercover operatives, and gang stalkers. Gang stalking is even modeled after the Schutzstaffel. Adolf Hitler, before becoming Reichsfuhrer, in his late 20s, early 30s, organized a beer hall putsch in which he sought to usurp leadership control over Germany. A coup which failed. He was imprisoned.
So a lot of it is kind of surface level imagery portrayed really
for a year, and in that time he wrote Mein Kampf, which is his flagship book of political philosophy concerning racial purity and what he believed a German Reich should look like. He called for annihilation. He called for subversion. He called for control. He called for the undying loyalty of his subjects, his heads of state, and his sovereign paramilitary forces like the Schutzstaffel. Adolf Hitler sought totalitarianism. He sought a future where a person's racial lineage was their uniform, and that the very trajectory of your life would be decided by this uniform. He sought depopulation of the European continent of persons that he declared to be subversive or unclean. Just as gang stalking is an introduction to how easy it would be to depopulate the United States of America of persons who are considered racially unfit, psychologically unfit, or otherwise unclean. And when I say racially unfit, ironically, that includes Caucasians. Because if you're a Caucasian or an Asian or an Arab or a Hispanic or a black person, or maybe you're a specific islander or a person of indigenous racial lineage to the Hawaiian Islands or perhaps American Samoa, you are expected in this new Reich to behave a certain way, to speak a certain way, to act a certain way, to pursue certain professions based on your culture and heritage rather than your merits and talents. This can be enforced by the denial of employment for some, using a covert system of institutional disenfranchisement. And yes, there are targeted persons across the racial spectrum that are inhibited in their ambitions to attain this career or this job or that job, so as to create an environment where a person is essentially allowed or planted in certain occupations through a covert system of thuggery, harassment, pestering, and disgusting actions against persons in the workplace and beyond. Me personally, I encounter gang stalkers on a daily basis to the point where I just know that they will follow me into a place of business should I become an employee of any corporation or company. These persons will attempt to use clandestine mechanisms to disrupt my workplace presence, my job performance, and even the ability to go to work. Because in various ways, I was prevented from attaining my academic credential through the damage and vandalism of my vehicle, making it difficult to make it to work on some days, making it difficult to get to my university and others, this thuggish, degenerate, hostile, hateful, and state-sanctioned undercover operative-based mechanism of buffoonery is derived from Third Reich ideals of the control of people who seek an academic credential or an occupation. You see, the Third Reich got to decide who went to what college and who took what job. A person can be easily sabotaged out of their job in the American workforce through sabotage by co-workers and by patrons alike. This totalitarianism is sought right here in the United States. And this blind obedience to the state that we're seeing in today's America is reminiscent of the blind obedience that the Schutzstaffel and derivative military and police forces had with respect to Adolf Hitler's will. There are no military personnel coming forward about gang stalking. There are no intelligence operatives or espionage agents coming forward about gang stalking. There are no undercover operatives or liaisons coming forward about gang stalking. There are no law enforcers or private security persons coming forward about gang stalking. Why aren't they doing it? It is because they are not necessarily targeted individuals, but rather participants in the disruption. Many of them and as a result of this disruption, the very trajectory of a person's life is decided by the clandestine elements of thuggery that are present in clandestine gang stalking. And that includes your inalienable rights to life, liberty, and happiness at the hands of a remote tribe of state-sanctioned buffoons that are reminiscent of the Nazi Gestapo. The Third Reich, its mechanisms made lots of minorities and persons that Hitler declared to be unclean hate Germany. Just like gang stalking is devised to make a person hate the United States, Jewish people of means were able to flee Germany and the resulting terror, just as targeted individuals like myself desire to flee the United States and its terror. One second, ladies and gentlemen. My lecture is occurring right now outside of the West Baptist Hospital in Kendall, Florida, near 162nd Avenue, just across from the West Kendall Parking Ride bus terminal. I'm doing this lecture in a small park outside of the emergency room. My significant other, Lori, has had respiratory problems over the past couple of months, and she is being treated. And while in the hospital, there were signals and cues being thrown about by the hospital staff here, so as to ensure that Lori and myself got the worst possible care possible.
amazing talent.
I pulled out my tablet so as to file a complaint, and that straightened out the nursing and the doctoral staff really quickly.
If you know and approach your way with a little bit of common sense, you can soon learn how to play fiddle. There's no
Gang stalking has permeated American hospitals, just as Third Reich elements permeated the hospitals throughout Germany.
You know, any 5-year-old kid can be taught to play the violin by 10. As you know, you can see
Patient care for a targeted individual, good patient care, is difficult to come by, because if a targeted individual needs to go to a hospital, they are followed to that hospital by undercovers, liaisons, and stalkers who are signaling persons outside and inside the hospital that this person is a deleterious person and is not worthy of good hospital care. As I entered the hospital, the security guard at the front desk gave many signals to the staff in the lobby, who relayed those signals to the nurses, who relayed those same signals to the doctoral staff, so as to give me and my significant other subpar or lackluster hospital care. Lori has had trouble eating over the past few days because of her respiratory symptoms, which include bronchitis and the onset of pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia. And the nurses still have not given her a meal since she has arrived here. That is a matter of signaling and disruption of our hospital visit. And if by the end of this lecture I go in and she still has not been fed, I will file a formal complaint with the corporate offices of West Baptist Hospital, which is unfortunate given that this is a hospital with a Baptist name on its logo. Religion doesn't matter to stalkers, only control. You could be in a Baptist hospital, you could be at a Catholic hospital, you could be at a hospital run by the Jesuits or the Order of St. Mary. It doesn't matter to a gang stalker. They will follow you in and pester you because they've been signaled to do so. I oftentimes call gang stalkers useful idiots because that's what they are. They are useful to the establishment, and they are blind in obedience and thus idiotic or ignorant in their actions. The Nazi Party, which was known formally as the National Socialist Germans Worker Party, was more fascist than socialist, although it incorporated elements of socialism in it with respect to the control that the government had over the means of production. It was founded off of Völkisch nationalist precepts, the ideology of Nazism, and the same Völkisch theories of Germanic divine superiority that von Liebenfels taught in his magazine The Ostara, which a young Hitler was a fervent reader of. The Nazi regime was anti-Semitic and anti-Marxist, anti-Semitic across the board. They saw persons of Semitic descent, that includes Jews and Arabs who both have Semitic ancestry, as inferior. It saw Asians as peculiar, however not on the same racial tier as Aryans. It saw African persons as inferior. It saw Turkic tribes as inferior. It saw Islander tribes as inferior. And racial segregation was a central component of Nazism, just as it is here in America. Racial segregation is back in full swing here in the United States because persons who seek homogenous communities, schools, churches, and workplaces can achieve those homogenous institutions through the systemic or covert harassment of persons who are not of the correct ethnicity or demographic. Even hospitals like the one I'm at now have a system of covert disenfranchisement that it uses against persons that are not of the right demographic or are of an undesirable demographic to the doctors, nurses, and staff of that hospital. As a matter of fact, I filed a complaint recently against West Baptist Hospital for the use of signaling mechanisms to disenfranchise myself and my significant other, Lori, when we were at the West Baptist Hospital on 89th and Kendall Drive just a number of days ago. The Third Reich was rooted in appreciation for mystery cults, the Knight Templars, the Teutonic Knights. There were a number of Hitler's administrators that were enamored by the legends of Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, which I am as well, but used these elements to form a cultish government that sought to control the lives of its police force in such a way so as to assume them as auxiliaries of the state rather than free-thinking individual persons. The SS, otherwise known as the Schutzstaffel, and its military and police officers went through a stringent background check to ensure that they were pure racially, so as to ensure that the entirety of the Germanic Nazi Third Reich military and police forces were pure in blood and were of the Nordic sort. The doctrine of Nazism that Hitler taught, that he lived, that he forced his employees across the country and in other countries that he had control of, were forced to adhere to this new religion, this Nazism, this symbol of Nordic purity and dominance over Europe to a T. And there was no escaping this clutch that Hitler had imposed upon the people. The Nazi mechanism was characterized in many respects by director and screenwriter George Lucas in his Star Wars movie franchise through the stormtroopers, which were similar in scope to the Storm Division that Adolf Hitler controlled, known in German as the Sturmabteilung. This Storm Division was actually the progenitor or the precursor to the Schutzstaffel. And when Hitler took it over,
Really, isn't it? So, anyway, it starts off nice and formal,
he
and then, summer is like a major shock because
used its structure
nice girls
to form the SS.
warfare and stuff, and that's not what it's about at all. It's like really
However, the
serious, aggressive,
Sturmabteilung,
heavy, hot
or the
summer.
Storm Division, remained in operation,
It's like an Italian one, so I get
and by April 34 had an army of 4 million
like, so do I actually, and
stormtroopers
really in trouble with the heat
throughout
like, with no asthma,
Germany.
and like having
Gangstalkers, ladies and gentlemen, are the new
like,
stormtroopers.
violence.
They're the new Gestapo. They're the new SS. And they do the bidding of the national security and intelligence apparatus here in the United States so as to control the trajectory of society through the ages, through disruption, disenfranchisement, and control, using the American population as the stormtroopers themselves. Adolf Hitler, in many of his undercover campaigns, very wisely used people who had no military or police training, just as gang stalkers, many of them have no military or police training. This is a way of gathering basically a standing army of people who are not aligned with the state in any official capacity and who have sworn no oath of service to the state or the country. They are a loosely affiliated conglomerate of signal takers and signal givers that follow these signals to a targeted person's location, be it work, academia, or in their own homes, so as to disrupt or diminish the quality of their very existence. In the name of human experimentation, human behavior modification, social engineering, the ability of the state to bypass the Constitution and act in a way that is conducive to a covert war against the life of the citizens. Having observed President Donald Trump over the years, I don't believe he is the type of man that would go along with such a program, which makes this thing as cataclysmic as you could possibly imagine, because the President of the United States does not have detailed information about clandestine gang stalking or its operations. He has to get his information just as you, the listener, have to get yours, and that is through the testimony of targeted persons like myself. Particularly considering the fact that no gang stalker, liaison, or undercover has the spine or the fortitude to stop what they're doing and come forward about this program. It's up to the targeted persons to come forward about this program, many of which are labeled as psychotic as a way to discredit them, a similar discrediting mechanism that the Schutzstaffel used against political dissidents. Political dissidents of all backgrounds were thrown into mental asylums and insane asylums and incarceration mechanisms so as to silence their dissent and their ability to speak out on the various horrors that they experienced at the hands of the Reich Chancellor. There was a wealthy class in Nazi Germany. There was a middle class, there was a working class, there were those that lived in poverty. They were all subject to the same laws and the same iron fist and the same covert espionage mechanisms that had been set forth by the Schutzstaffel through its Gestapo. The Nazi ideology was easy to ascertain. It was simply eccentric, blind obedience to your Führer with no questions asked at the threat of incarceration. Or even death. The Schutzstaffel oftentimes various persons in the Schutzstaffel devised various songs or poems that the Nazis aspired to live by. One of these poems read, "Although they may pierce you, fight, resist, stand by you, yourself may perish, but keep the banner high. Others may win victory when you're laid to rest, and shall gain that glory to which you aspired." This quote, this passage, this phrase, this song, this poem illustrated the Naziist ideal of an eternal Reich. Though you, as a Nazi, may perish, keep the banner high so the next generation of Nazis will flourish. This was to continue through the ages, just as gangstalking was before I exposed it. Be proud, I carry the flag. Have no cares, I carry the flag. Love me, I carry the flag. Nazism was a banner of terroristic horror, ladies and gentlemen. When all are disloyal, then we remain loyal, so that also always upon this earth there may be a banner in front of you. This banner of Nazism was a central theme in these poems. The banner of loyalty, the banner of eternity. The swastika on our helmet, black, white, and red armband, storm detachment, Hitler is our name. This poem illustrated the Nazi Socialist German Workers' Party's ideal of not peace through military, but order through military. Clear the streets, the SS marches, the storm columns stand at the ready. They will take the road from tyranny to freedom, so we are ready to give all of ours, as did our fathers before us. Let death be our battle companion. We are the Black Band. This Schutzstaffel poem illustrates that they were in control of the trajectory of the lives of the German people. Clear the streets, your lives, your blood, your loved ones. It all belongs to the Reichsfuhrer. Ladies and gentlemen, make no bones about it. Gangstalking is the new Gestapo. There is simply no arguing this fact. Gangstalking was indeed based upon the Gestapo, its precepts, its terror, its secrecy, its absolute power. Created in 1933, it grew rapidly over the years because a lot of German men saw the uniform, the banner, the promise of a free Germany ruled by the Aryans as noble, as notable, as desirable, as worth giving their all to. There are no gray areas when talking about Nazi Germany. Either you liked what they did or you don't. What is totalitarianism? Well, it's something that has to be brought about slowly. You see, the Third Reich took power militarily through the military prowess of Hitler and his disciples, his heads.
You know, you can see the hair, like
Heydrich, Himmler,
it's a great anti-hunting story, really.
Schreck,
The blood and the
Eichmann,
what is happening is really
Göring,
well in the music, and so I see it at the end, a kind of caricature of the Hunt crowd going off.
Frick.
Movement I see as a kind of warning of the nuclear explosion and very bad when it's going to happen. It's a bit
Okay.
like mushrooms and stuff. And like,
They all.
Just taken as inspiration from substances also. I mean, it could be. It's all about stuff in one kind of premature, like picture of the nuclear bomb explosion.
Were
like also kind of a little bit
students of Nazism
messed about in the head.
and regarded it as more than a political theory. They saw it as life itself, a future for Germany, something that was unable to be broken by political dissidence or by anything that resembled normal thinking or human rights. You see, Adolf Hitler regarded himself as the Messiah of Nazism. He saw himself as the King of Germany. He saw himself as the Emperor of Europe. His standing army of thug units, those thug units that were state sanctioned, that bear a striking resemblance to the gang stalking mechanism in scope and operation. Those thug units that no man, woman, or child could ever dream of usurping because of the sheer magnitude of their power and of their capacity to spill the blood of any man, woman, or child that it saw as an immediate threat to its sovereignty over the people. I have experienced untold levels of espionage against my person. As a matter of fact, I've mentioned in various lectures the undercover operatives that operate out of Olympic Park, which is just behind the Miami-Dade Public Library, is operating cohesively with a zealot thug of a police officer named Officer Jay Hunt to try and create a pretext to use excessive force against me. I've mentioned in past lectures this civilian patrol that I took on back in April to patrol Olympic Park looking for suspicious persons or activities. This patrol is one that I did alongside a Miami-Dade police officer that I corresponded with regularly for about an 8-month period. And alongside this officer, I was able to send tips that resulted in the arrests of sex offenders, career criminals, dope dealers, felons, and other people that sought to use various intimidation tactics against myself and my significant other, Lori. These undercover operatives have gotten together with this police officer in an attempt to spite my civilian patrol and make it difficult for the progress that me and the officer I'd worked with to thrive. How are they doing this? Well, the very thugs, felons, sex offenders, and dope smugglers that me and the officer were surveilling are being used by this new officer, Officer Hunt, to now surveil me. To create false narratives about me. To create lies about me. To create lies about my significant other, so as to find a way to push us out of the community, incarcerate me, or use brutality against myself. Yes, the very felons and career criminals, 2 of which I assisted an officer in arresting, are now being used by undercover operatives in and around Miami-Dade Public Library system to surveil me. They've turned the tables. Now those criminals are surveilling me with the assistance of the library staff at Kendall Lakes Library, the downtown library, and various other libraries around Miami-Dade County to surveil me. Yes, undercover operatives indexed to the Miami-Dade Public Library system has recruited staff members of various Miami-Dade Public Library branches and other people that they've worked with, including members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who have sent spies to Kendall to assist these felons and these library staffers and the corrupt police officer in turning the tables and surveilling me. Now, I'm not here to bash the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. As a matter of fact, I hope that they gain insight into gang stalking through my lectures. But there are elements in the church that use espionage of the sort that were used by the Schutzstaffel's Gestapo to watch, surveil, and disrupt me so as to cause some sort of a cataclysm in my life that those particular spies could point to the sky and say it was the work of the Almighty Creator. He was a sinner. He was a fornicator. He wasn't worthy of our priesthood. He wasn't worthy of our justice. He wasn't worthy of our love. And now he is a former member and apostate, one who the Savior Jesus Christ has shunned, and one whose life Satan will control. I believe very strongly that there are Department of Defense and Department of Justice aligned members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who are working in tandem with Miami-Dade Public Library System and the Olympic Park felons that I once surveilled to turn the tables and cause cataclysms for me, your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, as I go about my daily life. I took that civilian patrol opportunity as a way to gain insights into the inner workings of signaling mechanisms, particularly those that were being used by violent, hostile, or other felons that hang out in Olympic Park behind the Kendall Lakes Library. I believe me and the officer that surveilled them and arrested a number of them did a good job. Now, various elements in Miami-Dade County who didn't like the idea of me assisting a police officer in cleaning up a park full of gangsters that the community has apparently become fond of, they're now trying to turn the tables on me, using espionage, deceit, trickery, false narratives. The sex offender who I helped the officer arrest back in August, if I'm not mistaken, is back around, and they're using lookalikes, these undercover operatives, the ones I call disgusting half-wits and animals. They are using that sex offender who was arrested in the early to mid 90s for perverted acts against a minor, a person who has to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life, every 7 years having to re-register, a man that has been to jail twice for not properly registering as a sex offender, a man who patrols the Kendall area on a bike, a man who used to hang out in Olympic Park and stare at children for hours upon end. This man and his acquaintances are being used by Miami-Dade Public Library System, its staff members who are apparently fond of this derelict and resent me sending him to jail through the officer I was working with doing citizen patrol. They resent that I sent their friend, this sex offender, this piece of garbage who carouses with career felons in Olympic Park. They resent me for that. And they are now using him and his acquaintances to surveil me with the help of a corrupt officer. I have forwarded these concerns to the mayor's office, and I believe that Mayor Daniela Levine Cava will take decisive action against this evil. Imagine being asked to do a citizen patrol assignment, ladies and gentlemen, and you do a work and you help local officers arrest felons, dope smugglers, pedophiles, career criminals, violent persons, potential rapists, burglars, and then the people around that community who sympathized with those animals got with a local police officer to work with those animals to turn around and surveil the civilian officer, me. These persons are commissioned not only by the library staff. These criminally minded, criminally inclined persons are commissioned by the library staff and this officer to surveil me now, to create lies about me through the disruption mechanism that is prevalent in gang stalking. Similar disruption and false narrative creation mechanisms were used by the Gestapo against the Poles. Some say, well, what was Hitler's justification for invading Poland? Well, the Gestapo and other SS components went to the border of Poland and created a fake skirmish and used radio signals to broadcast a fake news program that was headed by a fake Pole to issue fake edicts of war against the German state. This act of sabotage and subversion was used as a pretext to invade Poland because the people didn't know any better. The SS didn't know any better either. They thought they were listening to a declaration of war by a disaffected Pole. But in fact, they were listening to a fake radio program that was being conducted by Nazi forces acting as a Pole, actively advocating for war against Germany. It never happened. It was derived. It was fake. It was staged. It was set up. It was derived. And Germany, its Nazi forces, used that derived news feed as a pretext to instigate the invasion against the Poles. Something similar is happening to me right now in Kendall, Florida, ladies and gentlemen. I have persons who were incarcerated not 5 months ago with my tip now being used by public auxiliaries, including libraries and law enforcers, to try and do the same to me. It is corruption. It is Gestapo. It is Nazism. It is Schutzstaffel. It is Adolf Hitler, ladies and gentlemen. Now, there are surely other regimes throughout history that have had similar components to their military that Hitler had. Hitler wasn't the first head of state to use clandestine means to monitor his population. But he used these clandestine means to suppress free speech and free thought. He used these clandestine means to subvert, to control, to manipulate, to bring about a loyalty that was unshakable because the people were too afraid to question his authority. the former president of Germany, who was president of Germany before Hitler, Paul Ludwig Hans Anton von Beckendorf und von Hindenburg, was a military officer and statesman who led the Imperial German Army. He actually was the one that appointed Adolf Hitler as the Chancellor of Germany. And a year later, he passed away. Paul von Hindenburg was the man that gave Hitler his power. And his successor, Adolf Hitler, became the Chancellor, or rather the Reichschancellor. It shows causation. No one, not even Hitler himself, could have known that his ambition for power would result in the deaths of millions of people. Hitler's fantasy was realized. He wanted to be the new Roman emperor. He wanted Nazi Germany to be the new Roman Empire. He wanted to conquer Europe the same way the Romans conquered the known world. He wanted to be Alexander the Great. He wanted to be Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He wanted to be Caesar Augustus. He wanted to be Cyrus the Great. He wanted to be King Nebuchadnezzar II. All combined into a head of state that could establish himself as the king of the universe. It wasn't enough for him simply to be the Chancellor of Germany. Adolf Hitler could have run Germany the way Paul von Hindenburg did, as a country that had alliances, an economy, a workforce, a military, a populace, a people, religion, a future. Hitler could have run Germany in a similar fashion. But that was not the vision that Hitler had for his eternal Reich. He wanted an eternal Reich. Indeed, he wanted a heavenly kingdom established here on earth now. And he had to subdue people to find that kingdom, that treasure that he wanted ever since a young man. No one, not even Hitler's parents, could have known when he was born into this world what he would go on to do. Adolf Hitler could have been aborted by his parents. He could have been a stillborn. He could have perished in an accident during World War I. None of these things happened. And he went on to become the most feared dictator in human history. Murder was his creed. Power was his creed. Loyalty was his creed. What is the creed that clandestine gang stalking has unleashed upon American society and possibly the societies of other countries? Murder, power, loyalty. If you get in our way, we'll get rid of you. If you dissent, we get rid of you. If you subvert, we get rid of you. We have our ideal population, and we are going to see to it that that ideal population succeeds. Even if it means population control, even if it means depopulation programs like the Holocaust. Gang stalking is no different. Gang stalking is a depopulation protocol, just as the Nazis' final solution to the Jewish question was a depopulation protocol. Hitler's final solution was a way of ridding Germany and Greater Europe of a demographic of people that he saw as deleterious. These people weren't monsters. The Jews had families. They had religion. They had occupations. They were the heads of various industries. They were business owners. They were laborers. They were fathers, mothers, sisters, and brothers. And they deserved a fair chance at life, liberty, and happiness just as the Germans did. Yes, there were elements of control of economies by Jewish financiers throughout Europe. That's documented. But as I said earlier in the lecture, if there was a problem with these persons dominating financial empires and industries, whether or not you thought this was being done with subversive or otherwise deleterious financial policies and practices, nothing beats good old diplomacy. Sit them down at a table, have a talk, come to some compromise. You don't need to slaughter innocent men, women, and children. That is just not good for the country. And mind you, Hitler's fantasy of an eternal Reich resulted in the heat of World War II being brought down upon Germany. Look at what the Allied forces did in Dresden, Germany. Even after Hitler's army was destroyed by Stalin's Soviet army, the Red Army on the Eastern Front, despite that victory for the Soviets, and despite Germany being neutralized by that destruction, the Allied forces bombed Dresden, Germany, and killed 200,000 civilians. There's no doubt Hitler loved Germany. There's no doubt Hitler loved his people. But he loved them to a psychotic fault, ladies and gentlemen. The German people embraced that love. I've uploaded a poem on one of my YouTube sites called The Hitler We Loved and Why, which is the author's own declaration of the love that Hitler and his people had for each other. Despite the evil Hitler was doing around the world, he was still loved by certain of his population, And his evil was embraced by populations of other peoples. Even to this day, there are still people that embrace Hitler. They're called Hitler enthusiasts or Nazi sympathizers. They embrace his bravado, his gusto, his fearlessness in his campaign to conquer the known world. That appeals to some people. Despite the blood shed and the rivers of blood that flowed at his command from his actions. Evil can be embraced. That's what that poem, The Hitler We Loved and Why, embodies, that evil can be embraced. Gang stalking can be embraced. I have numerous references to Adolf Hitler, the Third Reich, and his various ministers and subcomponents, his armies and police forces on a number of my websites. So people can draw the parallels between clandestine gang stalking and the Schutzstaffel. You may notice that my language on the American Republic is brutal and oftentimes critical, very critical. But that's by design. I don't want to see America continue on and being the Fourth Reich. It is the Fourth Reich because it has given its national security elements and its intelligence apparatus broad and unchecked powers to wreak havoc in people's lives, just like Hitler gave Heinrich Himmler broad and unchecked powers through his Schutzstaffel to wreak havoc across Europe. The moral of the Nazi conundrum is this: you cannot kill your way to a preferable society. You cannot sabotage your way to a preferable society. You cannot deprive people of their inalienable rights en route to a preferable society. Gang stalking seeks to use state resources to help some and harm others en route to a preferable society for an ideal population. The federal establishment of this country already knows what its ideal citizen is. Look at my 5-part series on the ideal population for more on this concept. Every government has its ideal population, the population of people that it feels that it works for. Adolf Hitler was no different. He had an idea of his ideal population. But he wanted to use programs like the Schutzstaffel, like the Gestapo, like the SD, like the stormtroopers, like the Order of the Death's Head. To achieve that ideal population, you cannot. All you can do as a head of state to ensure that the ideal population thrives and those subversive to society are punished is by rewarding good behavior, incentivizing workplace success, and punishing criminal subversion. You don't use programs like gang stalking to disrupt people that you think are less than ideal and allow people who you think are the ideal population to perpetrate these crimes against people, these crimes against humanity. I've said it before, I think Donald Trump is a decent man. And I don't think he has a full knowledge of what gang stalking is or what it aims to be. I think once President Trump understands gang stalking and understands how disruptive it is and how bad it makes America look, and how it could leave a stain on a legacy and image of the United States, I think he'll take action to repeal it. Thank you for tuning in.